So here we are in video 2 about Lightwave's IK. I think we should get straight on with it, ought we not? What we have here is a simple little IK system which by now ought be familiar, set up with a IK plane bone there to keep the whole thing working in 3D, and that's grand. You may notice I have this extra bone there. That's just there to illustrate a certain point, but it's simply an FK bone, and we'll see in a moment why I've got that there just for a simple note. The first thing I want to take a look at in this video is the IK-FK blending, that is Lightwave's own built-in IK-FK blending, and explain how this guy works. Put simply, when you have items that are using IK as their control method, you have access to this IK-FK blending control, which, funnily enough, blends you between IK and FK. You'll notice how it's denoted here, IK/FK, therefore 0% is IK mode, and 100% is FK mode. You'll notice now that I've gone into FK mode, the goal is no longer affecting the chain, and I can grab these things and move them around using forward kinematics on the channels that were previously controlled by IK. This value is envelopable, so as you can set up some sort of switch in the viewport based on a null or a slider or whatever else, or animate it just straight in the graph. All seems to work good and pretty well, but as I've pointed out at some previous point in this series, there are a couple of little tricks to it, and its functionality is not all pervasive. It does leave you with a couple of small hang-ups, which we'll see right now. So here's our first thing to look at, the IK plane item that we use. Remember, of course, this is not using IK, it's using target item to target the goal. Set up incorrectly, what you will have when your IK items have been switched to FK is the fact that this IK plane item is still functioning on target. This means that although we've switched out to FK control for this chain here, any movements of the goal, or of course any movements further up the hierarchy that the IK chain is a part of, taking the hierarchy as a whole away from the goal, will still cause movements to occur, which is clearly going to give us problems. You can notice a couple of things here. First of all, I have the unaffected by IK of descendants turned on for this item, which would be normal. Remember, of course, this is our first IK bone, and so its immediate parent, which in this case is the IK plane item, would have this toggle turned on to terminate our IK chain. That's fine. The problem of this happening comes from this control here, the chain checkbox. This checkbox is related to the IK-FK blending control, hence why it's right next to it. What we'll notice is that when I turn chain on, motion in the goal no longer causes this item to target. We can see that the IK-FK blend control has taken over the targetability of this item as well and blended it out. Blending it, of course, back to FK rotation, like this. This is important because it shows us what the chain checkbox does. The chain checkbox is kind of like the unaffected by IK of descendants checkbox, in that it represents a terminal item. But rather than preventing IK from affecting points further on, it terminates the IK-FK blending control. Therefore, you will notice that both this item and both of the IK items here have chain checked on. We notice what happens if, say, I uncheck it for the second bone here. You'll notice that the IK-FK blending has gone back down to 0, whilst here it's still up at 100%. And when I move the goal, what we see happening is this one item tries to respond using IK, but these others do not so. This means that you can get IK-FK blending either for whole chains or parts of chains, and also you can separate out pieces of chains to be blended between IK and FK. This works not just at the top of the chain, but further down the chain as well. It's purely dependent upon the state of this chain checkbox. For instance, here I have added an extra null and made it a child of the goal item, and I've set this bone here at the end to target that item. This gives me a locked off behavior for that bone. So as when I am operating my IK chain, the end item will stay oriented like this to the turns of the goal item. But because this is still checked for chain, the IK-FK blend sees it as a part of this entire chain. Thus, when I blend out to FK mode, the goal rotations no longer affect that bone either. Here, however, we hit upon a problem, which is probably a small bug in this whole setup. What we notice is with this guy having a target set up down here, look what's happening to our IK plane. It's no longer functioning. It is switched off, even though it ought not be. The reason for that is the unaffected by IK of descendant switch here. When you want items like this to be part not only of the chain, you also want to make them affected by IK of descendants. Otherwise, a targeting style behavior down here in the chain cancels off the one further up here in the chain. As such, when setting up systems using this control, we would not put unaffected by IK of descendants on this item, but would instead put it on the parent item of the entire IK-FK system, for which we can also uncheck the chain option if we were wanting. This will now give us a system where everything all works together. Another note for this blending in and out of the target control is that it doesn't just work for target, it also works for pole. So if I create a pole item thus, let's say, which will operate the bank of our IK plane here, giving us a pole vector style control for the limb, we can notice that when we operate the IK-FK blending, the pole behavior is also blended out. It's in throwing the blend switch at this point that we notice the problem that we really have with Lightwave's IK-FK blending system. Let me just kill off the targeting for that last bone because it's doing a little spin, which isn't incorrect, but it does confuse things a little bit when looking at it all visually. And I'm also going to remove the pole item from here for simplicity. What we notice with the IK-FK blend, of course, is that when we throw it, our IK plane goes back to its base state, or its keyframe state, of course, because it is being transitioned into FK. This means that if we're in a pose such as this that we've achieved through IK, and we wish to switch our character over to FK control, whilst we can key our IK items like this, when the switch is thrown, the entire system will move out of place. What we cannot do is a snapped blend, unless, of course, we keyframe this guy as well. By doing that, when we throw the switch, the entire system stays in place. Similarly, we have the inverse issue when going the other way. So let us presume that we have made some manner of FK pose, such, like this perhaps, and we managed to, pop the old IK goal back into where it would be in space. Then what we get when we blend back into IK is a separation of pose. Partly because this targeting IK plane item swings round, but also, of course, because when posing in FK, I've posed on more than just the heading axis. I also posed this bone here on pitch, and the IK-FK blend control cannot take account of that. This can make the whole IK-FK system a little bit of a problem for an animator, because when they want to blend out of FK and back into IK, they've got to go through and reset whatever channels were not being IK controlled. When they've got to blend the other way, they've got to try and account for this if they want the pose to stay matched. Or, alternatively, they may simply have an IK pose, such as this, at one frame, come out some other frame here where they wish to have transitioned into an FK pose, and try and get the in-between blend between the two poses to flow just correctly. It's not the tidiest system that you can get animation-wise. Most certainly for systems like this where you do want a 3D rotation at the top, such as a shoulder or a hip. It can be a real pain for animators having to switch back and forth, key this item, reset whichever channel, and so on. An alternate system that can be set up would serve something like this, where we can produce some manner of FK pose, thus switch over to IK with the entire system staying completely locked and not moving, putting us then into an IK control mode, and when an animator wishes to go back to FK, they can simply grab the actual FK items themselves, such as the shoulder, elbow and wrist, keyframe those, and when they switch back into FK, once again everything stays locked, nothing moves. This is a better system for an animator, but does require to be built from scratch, as Lightwave's internal IK-FK blend control we see here just will not handle it. Of course, that does not mean it doesn't come in useful. As we see, the major problem is what happens on account of having this IK plane and a 3D joint, such as a shoulder or hip, for the top item of our IK chain. If we've got something mechanical, where perhaps we've only got action on a single axis, then the built-in IK-FK blending control can be exceedingly useful. So that simply is Lightwave's own internal IK-FK blending control and how to use it, and of course how it mixes in with target, pole, the chain control and the unaffected by IK of descendants control. We will move right along then and look at something else, and may as well come off that little trick that we just saw previously about using a second null and target item to create a motion of the last item that is locked to the rotation of the goal object here, to introduce the match goal orientation feature, which unsurprisingly causes the item to be matched to the orientation of the goal, as we see thus. What match goal orientation, or MGO for short, is pretty much nothing more than a simple kind of orientation or rotation constraint. It constrains the rotation of the item to a goal object. Like all such rotational constraints, this of course has dependence upon the orientation of the item's axes themselves, their local spaces and directions. So of course if we switch to the move tool here and look at the local axis for the goal item, we can see that they are the same as that for the bone there. It is those that will be locked together. Notice also how this interacts with recorded pivots. So let's say that I turn my goal here to -90 degrees on pitch and I record its pivot rotation. We see that whilst this is at 0, 0, 0 here, its actual local space coordinates have realigned, and it is those on the bone which are forced into alignment with match goal orientation on. Clearly demonstrated by the fact, as you saw, that I rotated this thing, recorded its pivot, but the bone didn't jump around in any way. And of course this is also true the other way round, so when we take our goaling item like this and record its pivot rotation somewhere such that it is now aligned differently, when it does its match goal orientation, it will snap back to join with the orientation thusly. There is something else to be said for match goal orientation, because oddly enough it doesn't just match the orientation of the goal, it will also match scale. So if you use the scale tool on the goal, then the item which is goaling towards it, let us say, will also scale along with. This can be a handy trick in some instances to exploit. If you remember back in Foundations, we saw what happens to a child item when its parent is scaled. Well, what we see that match goal orientation does is allow us to have a child item scale constrained via MGO to another item, and the parent of that item, or parents, can indeed be scaled themselves, whilst this will remain locked to the scale of the goal item. It's kind of like being able to have a world checkbox mode in the scale item for same as item control. We can also notice, of course, that this is fine when doing stretching rather than uniform scaling too. So a handy little trick when you have something that you want to scale its parent but bring it back down, and you don't want that axial stretch effect to occur when rotating within the parent space. The other point that's very important to remember about using MGO is that unlike other types of rotational constraint, it has no way of reporting keyframes nor way of blending. You notice, of course, on the panel there's no envelope button. It's either on or it's off, and that's your lot. We also notice that if we rotate the goal itself somehow and then look at the actual values for rotation on the item which is tracking the goal, we see that there is nothing recorded for it. If we keyframe it, once again, we see that nothing happens. This means that an item that is using match goal orientation cannot have that rotation that it is at extracted. For instance, you can even see the handles themselves. They appear untwisted. They are in exactly the same spot as they were when this bone was pointing straight ahead. It's as if it hasn't moved, and yet it has. This means if you want an expression or something to take a reading from the values of this bone's rotation or this item's rotation, you cannot do it. It also means that if you are wanting to bake any kind of animation on an item that is using match goal, it will not bake. It is simple enough to jump around this. You just have to use a sibling item. So in this case, I'm just going to add another child bone here to this guy, which we can see is a sibling of the other one. I can then use the regular same as item rotational constraint, but I must turn on world mode. And like that, I can use a secondary item that will report values or will be bakeable. Clearly, if this were to be a hierarchy that I were wishing to bake out or some such, then the bone doing the constraining here using same as item would be my actual, in inverted commas, bone, whilst this would be a helper bone, helper item, that simply did the MGO but wasn't a part of the final, in inverted commas, rig itself, so to speak. What these little tricks of MGO also mean is that applying a goal object to something isn't simply limited to usefulness within IK or bones or anything else. You can use it on single items or whatever else anywhere in a scene, IK or not, under any kind of motion control system or FK system, to get this kind of constraining behaviour between one thing and another. And as such, it can be a helpful little tool to pull off the odd bit of trickery every now and then. Whilst then we are talking about goals, we may as well look at the other settings for goals, such as this one next to MGO, keep goal in reach. What this sort of does is give you kind of like a bidirectional constraint that will prevent the goal from going away from the actual end of the IK chain. It can't be drug out. This works backwards, so of course if you take the parent parts of the chain and pull them back away, it takes the goal along with for the ride. This might have some creative usefulness in one or two situations, but an awful lot of the time it can tend to create a bit of a mess for animators. For instance, this is keyed here at whatever positional value it happens to have. Dragging this back doesn't change that. That remains, and so when you then try and operate the goal, it has to update those keyframes as well, or rather those values within the keyframe. This little guy provides something of a demonstration of how it sort of could work, but also how it sort of doesn't. What we have here is just a very simple sort of man-shaped set of bones with 4 IK limbs. Each limb has a goal item with keep goal in reach on, and at no point in the IK chain does anything terminate the IK, so unaffected by IK of descendants is always off. What we can see is that this gives us something of a full body IK type of control, allowing one goal or another moved around to drag everything along else with it for the ride. But you notice, of course, when I do grab them and suddenly start dragging them, keyframe values get updated and the whole thing sort of jumps and skips about, which isn't very pleasant, unfortunately. As I say, there are some limited situations where it can come in useful, but some of the really clever stuff like this that you just wish it did, unfortunately it does not. So, sticking with the goals even more, we're going to have a look now at the objective setting here for goals, which we can see so far has been using the go to goal option, which is what you'll always use in situations like this where you're wanting your regular old IK behaviour. the item goes to the goal position. Pretty simple. These objective methods, though, aren't just for using things at the ends of IK chains. They can also be used on single items in the same way as MGO was. So here I have another bone that's got nothing to do with this hierarchy. It's a completely separate hierarchy of one bone. I can give it our goal object, tell it to go to goal, and we notice, of course, that nothing happens. But if I set its position to IK, we can see that it will indeed go to the goal position. In this way, we can use the go to goal objective function as a kind of positional constraint. What else do we have then? Well, we have point at goal. If I set that, this time I would go to rotation and set the heading and the pitch to IK. And what I get there is effectively a target behavior coming out of the bone. Notice, however, something that echoes or mirrors somewhat what we saw in the pole and target video. If we set it so as IK is only on the pitch channel for this item that should be pointing at the goal, so we're doing a target on pitch only, we get this sort of stuttery behavior, and we get much the same thing if we put it on heading alone. We can see that the bone sort of stutters about in its targeting behavior there. You'll also notice that if I set the bank controller of this bone to be IK, it does not do a pole item style motion toward it. So point at goal is kind of like an alternative to point at target. The last option then is YZ plane through goal, and the YZ plane is the two-dimensional plane drawn out by effectively the Y and Z axis there. So imagine a plane running straight through our little orange bone here that away. This, of course, is the bank direction. So by setting YZ plane through goal and the bank to IK, what we get is this pole item style behavior, where the bank axis will point toward the goal. Because our controlled item here is using IK as its method of control, forgetting the goal objective methods, that means that the IK-FK blending control can be used. Therefore, you have another kind of positional constraint, target or pole, which can be blended. Whilst position using same as item can be, target and pole have no blend option. This is effectively a way to set up target and pole with a blend. Of course, do notice that what happens is that you are blended between whatever the keyed value of something is and the result of the target, pole, what have you. So in that sense, it's very similar to the same as item blend percentage value here, meaning that if you're wanting to set up a partial or 50% constraint, then any keyframes that wound up on this item would of course alter the result. You may be thinking that of course that means you can set up the IK plane mechanism using goal objectives rather than target and pole. And you can, and you see that's what I've got here. In this case I have this green bone which is polling in inverted commas to this null, and this pink bone which is targeting in inverted commas towards the main goal, and that gives me something not too dissimilar. But because this is across two items that have to be arranged hierarchically, we wind up with something that can have certain failures at certain times. We can see, for instance, the end of our IK chain there, if you watch very closely, is drifting around by the goal. It's not locking that well. Of course, that's because we've got a hierarchy of rotations here, and as such, it's not a particularly useful method. With that, we move on to the last pertinent setting in the whole goals tool set, which is of course the goal strength option here. Goal strength basically just affects how aggressively a goaling item tries to reach for its goal. Now, in the single item examples that we just saw, that doesn't make much difference. Really, it's how it operates within chains. So I'm sure you'll remember this little setup from the first video where we've got 4 bones with 2 goals going on in them, and we can see the sort of mild misbehaviors that we get. For instance, here, we would expect this bone to straighten out more to try and reach for its goal. What we can do, in consequence, is to take the item that's reaching for that goal and simply increase its strength, which we notice does work. It pulls the item toward the goal more, but, of course, notice what has happened here. This guy has now come away from its goal. Of course, it has a much lower goal strength value. As we can see, what this does is it gives us this sort of drifty goal at the mid-chain point here. And this is really where goal strength comes in most useful, when you are using chains with multiple numbers of bones and multiple goals. Though as you can see here, it's still not quite a perfect solution. As it happens, it tends to be more useful to use in situations like this, where we've got long chains of bones going on, just like we saw earlier. And in this case, this item has go to goal for the second goal object, and of course, as we can see, a reduced strength, whilst the goal strength for this guy is turned up to 100. We can see that whilst this does help with the shaping of the chain somewhat, we are still getting a drift away from the goal point here as a result. We can try and fix it by punching the goal strength up even higher, and that tends to work better. But what you can see we're needing is quite a disparity between the goal values in order to keep the end item here locked in place, and all that's really done for us is just reduce the influence of this goal to an almost meaningless kind of operation. Now, there are perhaps certain things that you can try and tricks that you can play around with. For instance, if we look at this setup here, we can see that what we've got is this very sort of sloppy, curvy, long chain IK, and that seems to work pretty well, and it does behave itself quite nicely. This little end bit here is maybe a little bit twitchy. You can see that the last bone in the chain there sort of trips around a little bit, although you could probably do something to try and help correct that. But as you can see, the overall movement of the thing does allow for, this kind of posing. However, it's not without its problems. Once again, you'll find that once something has gotten into a certain shape, trying to get it into others can cause all kinds of breaks because of the multiple goal behavior here. So we can see that in a few places where things start to go wrong. Also, of course, we can see that the method that has been used here, specifically, we see that the way that it's been done has been by setting up something with a mid goal, but with the IKFK blending set. This means that the thing isn't reaching fully for the goal. It's kind of analogous to tweaking around with goal strength. You're getting the results of two things. You're getting a little bit of FK and a little bit of IK sort of blended together, so you don't get a full 100% goal reach behavior. The problem that you get with that, of course, is the fact that it is using a blend. So just like we saw in same as item, what happens when you have something on a partial blend and you key it off, you wind up getting these compounding adjustments going in like that. Because of course what we are getting, the actual pose of the chain, is a partial IK solution, partial FK solution. The blend isn't actually any kind of strength factor, it's sort of a cheat, and unfortunately it completely starts to break the behaviour of the chain like this. So since goal strength isn't really going to save us an awful lot in a lot of situations, we may wonder how it is that we are going to go about fixing situations like this, which of course I said we would take a peek at. And the solution is quite simple. Basically, when we are doing long chains like this that want to use multiple goals, the best way to do them is to break them down into subchains. So I'll take this bone here and add a child to it, which I'm just going to colour green there for clarity. This item, rather than this one now, will take the goal objective. And to begin with, our behaviour isn't much different at all, but of course what we do with this item is to turn on unaffected by IK of descendants. We now have two completely independent IK chains, effectively one after the other, or one following the other. And further, of course, we take this item here, which would be the first bone of the next chain, and we parent it under that one. This of course means that these two IK bones come to this parent, at which point the IK chain terminates. And then we have another IK chain here. And what we see this gives us is a far more predictable and solid setup that behaves in pretty much the exact way we would expect it to. So there we go, using multiple goals, multiple chains linked together, and the different settings that are available for our goal items. So then we have a couple of other last little things to look at on this panel. First of all, we're going to look at the base on menu here. This is to do with our prebend. As you will recall, I am quite sure, you need to have a certain amount of prebend in your IK chain in order to instruct the solver which way round you want the items to bend. But this prebend is obviously a keyframe. It's a recorded value. What this drop-down essentially allows you to do is alter the keyframe from which the IK will take its prebend. So far we've been on base on first keyframe, and of course our prebend has always been done at frame 0, which is the first and, as it happens in these examples, only keyframe. Let us imagine a situation though where for some reason, most likely to do with our character mesh, we have had to set up the bind pose with our IK chains perfectly straight. What we can do to remedy the whole prebend situation in such circumstances is create another keyframe somewhere, usually in the negative range, and put our prebend into effect there. In this case, I've used frame -1, so that now becomes the first keyframe, so I do not need to change this setting. Everything still works as it would do. But you can, for instance, specify a particular frame number. You can also base it on the most recent keyframe, so if the IK chain were getting keys applied to it whilst in animation, it could base off whatever the last keyframe was, or it could base it on the current time. Of course, you would also need to have a keyframe recorded for the current time. These two are less helpful, and I've really not come across situations where you would want them. Either first keyframe or a specific frame is usually what you would want to get yourself out of a bit of a bind. This would also work if, for some bizarre reason, our bind pose had the IK chain bent in completely the opposite direction to that which we wished it to bend in animation. We could still have an alternative keyframe bent in the correct direction. The result would be that the IK still behaves as we wished it to, irrespective of the totally backwards bind pose. The last thing then here is the soft IK options. Traditionally, IK has this problem that when a chain approaches full extension, the angle gets very shallow. You get a sudden snap as it pops into a completely straight line. When animating, this could cause little twitches at knees and elbows as they suddenly snapped out for the last degree or two. What soft IK does is it softens up how quickly the IK controlled items will rotate to reach the extremities of pose. This can be done in either an exponential manner, a linear, or a clamped manner. Also taken into account is the length of the chain, which can either be the chord, which is the distance from the goal to the root, the chain length, which is the overall length of the chain, or given lengths where you manually input certain lengths that would exist between. What you can see we get when we have soft IK is at certain positions and poses, the IK matches up directly to the goal point. But as we come closer to full extension, we can see that the goal starts to drift away from the actual point where we wish it to be. This amount of drift can be altered by tweaking the values here. So 100% would push it right out at the extreme pull out of the IK, whereas of course the other percentage is what happens when we come close here. So we're getting close to the root, and therefore changing this value would alter that behavior there. For some rare setups where you do need a loose behavior, this can be good, but for things like arms and legs where you need contact with a surface, you need a lock off of the IK, it's pretty much not that useful, as all it does is create a drift between the actual chain and the position of the goal, which of course you do not want. One of the interesting things to note with Lightwave's IK is that even with no soft IK selected, there is still a softened behavior. Notice that as we pull out to full extension here, the goal starts to come away from the point of intersection before the IK chain has completely straightened. Let's get in nice and tight there, so as we can view this more clearly. We see the goals start to drift away, but look, the IK bones are still straightening out. We have already got a mild soft effect. The other thing to notice that's exceedingly important is what happens when we pull back. Notice that there's a tiny little drift away of the point of intersection from the goal there, and it's only as the chain comes a bit closer that it catches back up again. This can be problematic, especially for feet, as if you have a character come down and his feet are supposed to contact the ground, they can sometimes push down a little bit and then bob back up, as this minor softness that is always inherent in the IK stops you having this perfectly locked off behaviour. There are a couple of ways to change how this happens. First of all is the amount of pre-bend that you put into the chain. Tiny little shallow pre-bends, such as this, will cause the behaviour to be worse, as you can plainly see right there, whereas stronger amounts of pre-bend thus cause the effect to be minimised, most particularly on the pushback, which of course is the most important thing. We can also up the goal strength. That will help out, again, most particularly on the pushback. And the other thing that is interesting, that is of great help, is the stiffness setting. On an IK chain, there is a sweet point for this, and it is a value of 0.22 on one, but not both, or all of the bones in the chain. And what we see coming close in there is that the amount of drift on the pushback is almost entirely eliminated, and there's just a little bit coming out there at the extension, which is much more in keeping with the kind of behaviour we do want. If you wish to kill off this behaviour at the extension altogether, then of course what you can do is use your limits, which prevents the chain from ever reaching full extension, or rather prevents the chain from ever going completely straight. This now becomes the full extension state of the chain. Having this chain that only comes to a certain level of bend and never goes completely straight is of course a pre-bind issue. So if we imagine here a leg which is modelled completely straight, then rather than having our base pose and bind pose of bones be a completely straight line, we would add a little bit of pre-bend in the bones already, and they would never become more straight than this under IK. Essentially, whether our limb as it is modelled is bent or not, there is always slightly more bend in the bones than there is in the mesh. This isn't such a bad thing, because it is often helpful to have your knee set ever so slightly in front of your hip and ankle anyway. Thus, using the limits method as well as the goal strength and the stiffness to completely lock down your IK chain in this fashion can be advantageous. So once again, we've seen quite a few details of the specifics of the IK system and the little controls and values for tweaking it and playing around with it. There's still a few last details of IK and using it practically that I want to go over, and we'll see that in the next video.